This is the Powered Up Podcast, show number 7.
And so I really wanted the kids to not only connect to what we were learning, that specific fact, but in each of the scenarios, they had to reflect on how they felt. Because whenever I taught history, I wanted the kids to understand that we were learning about something that happened to people, just that people living in a different time period, and that those people are the same as us. They are just in different experiences.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt EdTech Neighbor Rogers. Matt, how are you tonight?
I am great. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing really well. I'm doing very well. So I want to kick things off. I want you to tell me about your favorite or most memorable lesson you had as a kid when you were in school.
Oh, man. Wow. So I will say one of my highlights was we were playing Jeopardy in a U.S. history class in high school, and it was a 1,000-point question, and the answer was Jesse Owens. And I knew it because I'm huge into track and field, and so I crushed it for our team, and it helped us take the victory. So that was one that I think back to. I always love being competitive. Another one that I absolutely loved was a science class in middle school, where honestly, all of my classmates were awful. It was a rough class that I was with, but my teacher used to bowl with my dad, and he and I got along really well, and I got to do some really cool experiments. So just those hands-on, kind of piquing my personal interests are what stick out to me. But man, it's been a while since I thought about it. Do you have anything that comes to mind?
I do. The best part of me throwing these questions at you is I get to think about them ahead of time while you have to scramble and think of an answer. So actually this relates to when we had Rhett on the show, and he talked about his jousting that he did with his kids, and actually that his kids came up with the idea. And if you haven't listened to that, go back. I believe it's show 3 is with Rhett Oldham. And so when I was in 6th grade, which is still elementary school where I went to school, we did this project. It was a long-term unit, and I don't really remember the big picture purpose of it, but I know that it was researching, I believe, Central America countries, or I think it was Central America. And we were in groups, and we did all different kinds of hands-on projects and presentations multiple times. It had to last a whole marking period. And I just remember in the group I was with, we found something about the place we were researching did horse racing. And we asked our 6th grade teacher, Mr. Cashman, we said, hey, can we bring our scooters in and do like an actual horse race on the playground yard, and have like the rest of the class like place bets, and we showed them all the research as to how foundational this was into the culture that we were researching. And he told us that he was going to talk to the principal to see if he was okay with it. And he told us like 3 days later that he got approval for it. So we were like on the edges of our seats for 3 days hoping. And we did this scooter race on the playground yard, and it was supposed to be a horse race. And I will never forget that feeling of like the teacher going out on a limb saying, hey, that sounds like a cool idea. Let me see if I can convince my boss to do it for you. And who knows, maybe he just made all that up just to make it seem like he was going out on a limb for us. And if he was, I really don't care. But it was not only just the lesson that he allowed us to do, but the fact that he went out on a limb for us. And I did win the race. That was a big part too.
So now that I'm thinking about this, I'm being flooded with these memories. Like this, I was actually telling my kids today in school about how when you rush through something, that doesn't necessarily mean you're successful at it. And I remember in third grade, I was working at cursive handwriting, and I wanted to be done first because I thought by being done first meant that you were best at it. And if you see my handwriting now, you will learn that that was not the case, and I regret that decision substantially. But I think one of the activities I go back to is we had an activity called this $1 Million House Project, which we may talk about a little bit later. But I remember being in fifth grade and physically having to go in and furnish this house, this dream house, and going through and getting an old school trapper keeper and putting different pages in and cutting out different images from magazines and kind of itemizing all the different activities or all the different items in the house and adding up to some number and just being blown away about how large that number was. A really cool activity.
What? This is getting really off topic, but when did the trapper keepers fade out? Because when I started teaching, kids only had binders. They didn't have the sturdy security of the zippered up trapper keeper.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like trapper keepers were in place of backpacks, and backpacks were just so much more durable. And again, this is my opinion, but if I could throw it over my shoulder and carry my lunch, or for me, carry my coffee, a lot of kids are bringing their water bottles and different things, and then unzip and have everything you need. I also probably think that now that we're carrying devices as well as just papers and homework, you kind of need a little more space to carry your stuff.
That's true. So we started with that question because we don't have a guest with us this episode, and having guests is by far one of our favorite parts. But I also do enjoy the time without the guests because it kind of gives Matt and I time to digest on things we've learned, reflect on things we've learned from our guests. So what we're going to do for this episode is we're both going to throw the look at your lesson part or segment of our show back at each other. This has developed into by far my favorite part of the show. I know Matt feels the same. We've talked about it a lot. It's really great to see what these teachers are doing. We've had just very different approaches from our guests so far. So what we're going to do is we are just going to go through the 6 questions. I'm going to ask Matt the 6 questions. He's going to share about a lesson from his class. We'll talk about it, break it apart a little bit, unpack it, and then he'll throw the same back at me. So the last thing I'm going to throw out there is, Matt, before we get started, because Matt and I did plan this, but I have no idea what he's going to talk about, and he has no idea what I'm going to talk about. So just for a little fun, I'm going to try to guess your subject, and you're going to try to guess my subject.
All right.
Sound good?
I am so ready.
All right, so before I kick it off with the questions, I'm going to guess that and there might be a little cross-curricular, but we have to go with what was the intended subject. I was going to say science, but I'm going to say math.
So you're going to be right with the math.
All right. So question number 1 is it a unit overview or a single lesson?
I would consider it a unit related, but it is a culminating project for the entire year.
Wow. Okay.
Kind of it takes all the skills that were developed through the 4th grade year.
Okay. So next question, what is the grade level, which we most likely know is 4th grade, but what is the subject area? And you've already told us the time of the year.
So this initially was specifically a math activity, and I'll kind of talk about it in a moment, but it has grown into just blurring the lines of being a subject specific. So there's definitely ELA elements to it. There are science elements to it. There's STEM features to it. It has grown and grown and grown, way bigger and further, and distinctively my most favorite thing that I get to talk about frequently. I was actually wondering, should I even talk about it? But it's by far, it's the unit that I try to represent or work towards in other areas of my year.
So I was right.
It was end of the year. It was math.
Okay.
You're right.
All
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
I didn't hear anything you just said except math.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. So what are the objectives of the lesson?
So the objectives of the lesson boil down to utilizing the mathematical skills and standards to successfully build a dream item. In the past, it has always been a house. Kind of going back to my old lesson, a nice little segue. But I've been toying around with other properties or items that we possibly furnish that would have similar attributes, but to kind of spice it up so siblings aren't doing the same activity their kids have, their brothers or sisters have done before.
What are some specific skills that they're utilizing, those math skills?
Do you want me to jump into the lesson or just keep it isolated still?
Yeah. Why don't you kind of give us a little bit of a picture of what the lesson looks like?
So I want to kind of, I'll back up and say about 3 or 4 years ago, Ken and I were getting into 3D printing initially. And it was one of those things that I had no clue how I was going to use a 3D printer. And it just so happened I took this course through a program called PD Campus on 3D printing. And while I took it over the winter, we came into kind of state testing times, and that finished. And we had an abnormally long time from the end of testing to the end of the year. And I'll whisper this and say, there's not a whole lot of learning that goes on after PSSA to the end of the year, traditionally, because you've jammed all of your curriculum before the state testing. In reality, I find it to be the best month and a half of the school year. Your pressure is down. You get to kind of do activities as you choose, and you see a lot of creativity. And so I remember sitting in my classroom being like, how am I going to utilize the next few weeks of school? And so I thought back to that earlier assignment, the $1 Million House, where I was cutting out magazine clips and trying to see a running calculator of how much my TV cost, which TVs have gotten a lot cheaper these days, but and so I decided, could I do something as almost like an homage to my 5th grade year with my 4th graders? They had iPads, they had the ability to do so, and we had Keynote. And so we started, the kids, I remember walking in, and the opening line was, I want you to go onto Google and find your dream house, your absolute dream house. Take a picture, put it on the first slide. And they had no other context. From that point, they went through and created a slide for every room they wanted to have. So they had a TV room and they had a game room. Apparently they needed to be separate things. I don't know.
Absolutely.
But they had kitchens, but they didn't have bathrooms, like all these logical things that some things they prioritized. They didn't need to have an oven or a microwave. They just had a sink. But it was just a really interesting activity. And that took a whopping, I don't know, day and a half for them to do. And so the next day I decided, well, why don't we talk about all of those rooms the kids had? They have to create blueprint, because one of the huge things in 4th grade is area and perimeter, whether it's area and perimeter related to multiplication and division, we'll say mastery. But we also had this attribute of they had to add and subtract up to 1 million. So with them adding these items in up to 1 million, they were adding and subtracting, they were multiplying, they were dividing, and now we were talking about area and perimeter. And so my favorite thing was they have these McMansions that were bought for $1 million, maybe in Waco, Texas. I don't know. Some of those home improvement shows have huge houses for cheap. And they now had to fit all of the rooms they identified into one single sheet of graph paper. And then they had to find the area and perimeter of the house. We talked about scaling. It eventually transitioned into the kids using geometric design through 3D printing, Tinkercad 3D design that we eventually printed out. And they ended up creating, with the addition and subtraction of shapes in Tinkercad, the exact floor plan, but in we'll say a $50 size that I printed out for them. And kind of pulling in the geometry and, again, scaling and all these different features. Well, this project grew and grew and grew into physical models that the kids had to fit on desktops. But I've had projects that were made out of Pokemon cards. I've had ones made out of Easter eggs. I've had houses made out of toothpicks and popsicle sticks, like a 300 stick wraparound porch that was suspended midway up, like incredible architectural design. My favorite is I had a kid that actually took shingles off his roof and tile out of his kitchen floor and put it into his model. Unfortunately, without asking his parents to do so. So I had to make a phone call home, and that was a little uncomfortable. But what I saw through this project, and I'll kind of open up a little bit more about it with some of the future activities, was it didn't have to be math specific. So in future years, I started having the kids create a Zillow, a mock Zillow. I found like a teacher pay teacher template, and they ended up writing up an advertisement, a totally different writing activity. They had to market, they had to take a specific picture, and a totally different writing activity. And then the best part was they would partner with a third grade learner that would be coming to my classroom the next year. And the fourth graders would be responsible to teach the third graders area and perimeter by the third graders getting to decorate a deck onto the mansion. So the third grader would be responsible to do one room of the fourth graders, and the fourth grader would add it to all their design. And the absolute best part was at the end of it, the third graders would come in and vote on best design, best use of budget, most like accurate. And so that give and take, that interaction between the third graders and the fourth graders was really cool. And we also created a competition with the teachers. The teachers would come on in and vote on those same categories. And the kids, the one year I went out and just got a local architectural firm donated like pens and like a notepad for the winner. We got like a fast food lunch or a special item from a local restaurant to donate as like, hey, thanks for all your work. And it turned out to really blend a lot of materials. And the neat thing was those first 2 days were planned by me. And then I brought up this idea of, hey, I'd love to use this 3D printing, or what could we do? And it really turned into a class discussion of other ways we could branch out this project. And it just grew and grew into something I'm just incredibly proud of every year. And like I said, it really puts all of their math skills specifically to the test for accuracy at the end of the year. So that's the long, short version of the activity.
It's really cool. I've obviously heard you talk about this before. I remember you telling me about a student who had a concussion, was not allowed in school, and stayed up till like 4 a.m. doing his Tinkercad design on his iPad, which he wasn't supposed to be on a screen. So that just further elaborates on the passion that the students have. So you pretty accurately described what the students are doing during the lesson. Quick question. Is it primarily independent? Is it partner? Is it choice? What does that dynamic look like as far as the students working?
So the activity is dynamically independent. What I mean by that is they kind of crowdsource between themselves ideas. They gather from each other. Hey, I found out how to do this. I actually, for instance, when I was first doing it, it was really the only reason I was using 3D printing early on. Now I use it much earlier in my school year, so I wouldn't teach it. But all I would teach kids is the intro to Tinkercad, and then I would not help them beyond creating their floor that matched their blueprint design. And at that point, they're building walls and different items. So that is from their end. They are either identifying it themselves or getting assistance from classmates.
Okay, that makes sense. So you touched on it a little bit, but very specifically, when you get beyond those specific skills that you have to teach, like you referenced the intro to Tinkercad, what is your role throughout the time that the students are working on this? Because they're all going to be at a different spot, a different pace, a different specific objective with the classroom. So how are you using your time?
I joke about taking a nap underneath my desk. And not that that's ever the case. There's always one kid that needs extra prompting, or to get back on task or finish early. That's absolutely a reality. But what I found myself mostly doing is, hey, I'm really struggling with this element. I had a kid that had picked a Victorian house and was trying to figure out in her blueprint on Tinkercad how to make a rounded edge. And for me, it took me a moment to realize that you just duplicate the same shape. One's a hole and one's a solid, and you bump the hole up and over a little bit and you can create that. But I wasn't going to allow that guidance. I'm not going to provide that answer. So I kind of played that item. What I feel like we do in this role is kind of push, challenge, and difficulty and deep thinking without frustration. That is the management in the activity. How do I kind of get them intrigued? How are they interested? How are they focused? How are they working hard? And then from that point, bump a little bit into almost frustration that they want to give up. But then they hear a classmate celebrate something they do and they're completely back in.
That's great. Last question. What advice have you given yourself, since you've done this multiple years and you've already talked about how you've developed it over the years, but what advice have you given yourself, and what advice are you giving yourself for this year when you roll it out again?
So this year is definitely going to be a different story, but nothing. I mean, we may not be able to vote traditionally, but I think one of those, we have a member of our school community that, instead of talking one-to-one when we went one-to-one, he talked frequently about one-to-world, and the idea of having access to outside of the four walls of our school. And I think this year more than any, not necessarily publishing for a mass audience, but publishing to get feedback from others, whether it's subject matter experts, architects, designers, these type items, to pull in some more realism into the activity, maybe have actual judges. But you mentioned the story about a kid of mine who got up early in the morning. What fourth grader gets up at 4 in the morning, concussion or not, to work and then go back to bed when their parents wake up? I mean, unfortunately, I got a notification it was done when he wasn't supposed to be working on it, and his mom works in my building. So he was not going to be successful. But one of the things that I think back to is, in that scenario specifically, yeah, I'm super proud of what he did. But I also had in that same class one of the lowest learners I've ever had in my educational career. An incredibly awesome kid who just struggled academically in a lot of different areas. He had recognized that my student with the concussion wasn't going to be able to finish the project, but I was still expecting him to stand in front of third graders and present his activity. So he went ahead and made a physical model for my learner with a concussion. So when he was cleared to come back to school, this one learner had a complete project that he was anxious and nervous coming back, that he wasn't finished. And a classmate of his that had no responsibility to do so made something that both of them were proud of. And they presented together this joint project. And it honestly, like, I got emotional. The idea of like, you're witnessing this kid that's going through extreme lengths and some health challenges to be at school, choosing to push himself to still participate in school outside of those school hours. That was impressive enough. Then you add another kid that didn't need to do anything, but recognized how another learner would feel and went to the extent to create something to make his classmate feel complete. Just really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I have two pieces of advice. One is more general, just to add to the conversation. I don't really think you need it, but I want it out there as a part of our conversation. And when you were talking about your role, and you joked about sleeping under the desk, and you talked about prompting that student and pushing them on that border of frustration. When you're approaching projects like this, it's a hands-on student-centered project, discovery learning, all PBL, all those buzzwords, all fall under this umbrella of students directing themselves. Something I really encourage teachers to do is to pre-plan your questions. The questioning during the lesson is really, really important. And a lot of times those questions aren't that complicated, but you'll find yourself when you're in this element, and if you've set something up successfully, the students are super engaged, and you kind of want to float around and help them, but you don't want to feed them answers. So just going around and asking questions. And I always try to have two purposes to my questions. One is it's feelers to see, do the students truly understand what they're doing? Because it can be deceiving at times where it looks like they're totally on task and they're really actually kind of struggling with the content. So one question will either be a feeler for me, kind of like that formative assessment. And then the other one is to promote higher level thinking, is to get the student to think about where they are, what they're stuck on, or what roadblock they're about to hit, and to get them to step back, reflect, and reach those higher level thinking skills. So my second piece of advice is, you talked about how the third graders come in, see the project, participate a little bit, and then vote on it, which I think is awesome. I think it probably builds huge excitement for them to come to your class the next year and wait an entire year to be able to do that project themselves. But what I think would also be cool is, why not have fifth graders come back and vote on best design and those best things, because they did it a year ago and they're a little bit more mature. So the glitz and glamour and the like bedazzling stuff, like that might catch the eye of third graders, but fifth graders might be like, no, like this one is very well designed, it's structural, like that type of stuff. So I think it would be cool to have those two different populations participate in the voting.
I think that's an awesome idea. The unfortunate thing is, if you don't know me enough, I make an absolute fool of myself for 180 days in a year, to the point that third graders are excited to have me. Fourth graders, I believe, love being in my room. And then fifth graders want nothing to do with me because they are too cool for school. We'll see if they'll be successful. I'll be successful. I love that idea. I think the one thing, before jumping into your lesson, the one thing that I'm so excited about that lesson each year is it was organic. It was a lot of give and take, and it was a lot of, hey, what else can we pull in? What other elements can we showcase? What other meaningful, right? I already had the intrinsic motivation. So what are those areas that normally kids would not be excited about doing that I could pull in? And it turned into families together making these projects and being proud of their presentations. And again, pulling in ELA, pulling in math. I hit the addition and subtraction up to 1,000,000, the area perimeter, the multiplication and division, the geometrical components, scaling, a ton, fractions and decimals as part of it as well, through a lot of the Tinkercad type activities. So when you talk about just pure summative assessment, almost, it was really clear who had, in a highly motivated, right, best case scenario activity, who had access to the instruction that they were supposed to have, who was successful, and it really to the test in a non-traditional assessment, which I thought was, it's always my most excited skill, because to be honest, if they didn't understand it before, I've said this before, they acquire that learning really quick if they need it. You put them in the position that they take the steps to acquire understanding to be successful, because they will put that extra time in to those things that didn't click before, or they didn't understand, why are we emphasizing this in isolation? Oh, when I see it in big picture, it makes a lot more sense.
Definitely. And from a standard objective point of view, those math skills that you highlighted are by far the most important skills that they learn in fourth grade that carry into fifth grade. So it's even just a great way to, like you said, close the gaps for the kids that didn't quite master it, and review it for everybody as they leave for summer and then forget it again.
Eventually, but it's something you can kind of hold over them. So moving into your activity, I'm going to take a guess. So I know that you have a big background in science and math specifically, but I actually feel like this might be an ELA activity.
Well, you are right. I have a big background in math specifically, and then science as well. It is not math and science.
Interesting.
But you'll just have to wait for question number 2, because that's where the subject area comes out.
All right. So when looking at this activity, is it an overview or a single specific lesson?
So this is going to work out well. I have a lot of examples that I could give that are very similar to you in terms of summative, pulling in a lot of subjects together, cross-curricular, but this is actually a single lesson.
Wow. I'm impressed. All right. I know a lot of your macro big units. I'm excited to hear. So I have a feeling it's going to be related to fifth grade. Correct me if I'm wrong, but clarify the grade level, subject area, and when it happened in a year.
Yeah, so this is when I was teaching fifth grade. It is social studies. So you were close. You were in the humanities.
Oh man, I think I already have an idea what this might be. All right, continue.
And the time of the year, it was around third marking period, so about 3/4 of the way through the school year. But to be perfectly honest, the time of the year was irrelevant. It was just when we got to this point in the curriculum.
Would it have to do with some art, maybe?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm totally off. I'm excited. Okay. So the next question in our lens is really these objectives. What was the goal that you placed out there for kids, and things that you were striving to accomplish through the lesson?
So this was when they were learning about the Revolutionary War, and I wanted them to really understand at a basic level the idea of David versus Goliath. The fact that the British Army had, countless advantages. This is what the colonial army had. This is how they gained some advantages. So I wanted them to try to understand at a basic level, and even just my understanding. I don't claim to be a historian or a war expert, but there were specific, pieces of our textbook that talked about this battle and why the British won and why the colonists won. And to be honest, the kids reading it didn't click at all. So I wanted them to really understand the big advantages that both armies had and how it played out in specific battles.
Interesting. I think you bring up a really good point about when you teach it at its surface level, a lot of times it doesn't click. And I have a feeling that you're gonna experience or live through what was going on in the story. So, or in history, what are the kids doing throughout this single lesson that is your highlight?
So, to quote Dave Burgess in Teach Like a Pirate, but my quote might be off, but the analogy will be spot on. I preheated the oven by building the excitement the day before the lesson. So their homework was to bring in 10 crumbled pieces of paper in a Ziploc bag. And they had to have that to participate in the following day's lesson. There was always a kid that would forget, and they would be upset because they knew it was coming. And I would say, there's, in the back counter, there's Ziploc bags. And they would look at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you probably have paper in your binder, and I won't know if it's from home or from your binder. Just go get a bag and fill it with your paper.
Yep.
So the paper was their firearms, and I would set up different scenarios. And so one specific scenario was I wanted them to understand that the British Army were professional soldiers. They were trained professionals, and the colonists were farmers. They were, they were just tradesmen who had guns and were standing up for themselves. And so I set up 4 different scenarios where they had to experience something, and it was to specifically teach something that happened in the war. So the first scenario was they were lined up straight across, facing each other. And the one group, I said, you're the British Army. The other group, you're the colonist army. And it was about a 2-to-1 ratio because the British Army was a lot larger. And I told the British soldiers that you can stand inside of a hula hoop. This was your range that you could stand inside. You can move your feet in there, but you can't leave this spot. You have to stay in your line. You can throw it however you want. I told the colonists that you had to stand with your feet next to each other inside of one tile. You cannot move your feet, and you have to throw with your opposite hand. And so the British Army creams the colonists. And then to follow that scenario, I had questions that were just printed out on a simple piece of paper, and it was reflection questions. It was, what were your feelings during that? What was your role? And then typically, it was, how does this connect to history? And so in this case, it was that the British soldiers had a huge advantage from skill. And so I really wanted the kids to not only connect to what we were learning, that specific fact, but in each of the scenarios, they had to reflect on how they felt. Because whenever I taught history, I wanted the kids to understand that we were learning about something that happened to people, just that people living in a different time period, and that those people are the same as us. They are just in different experiences. So another example was they had to throw, after they threw a piece of paper, which was a bullet. They had to untie, take off a shoe, put the shoe back on, retie it, and then they could throw again, and then they had to repeat the process. And so I wanted them to understand that loading a gun was a 60 to 90 second process for the soldiers. So I wanted them to really feel what it was like to be just standing there waiting to get hit with a piece of paper and not being able to defend themselves at all. So in doing so, a big part of this was explaining to them, these are specific scenarios that I am designing for an intended outcome. It is not a game. It is a scenario to play out an outcome. So, bobbing and weaving, they couldn't do that with bullets. You can't do that with the pieces of paper. If you get hit, you're out. It's not a game. But, naturally they had a ton of fun while they were doing this. I'll give one more scenario. The other one that's popping in my head, I'm forgetting the fourth, is I had some of the colonists in the room, some of the British in the room, and I said, you can throw back and forth. If you get hit, it's okay. You're not out. And then I had the others in the hallway. The colonists just walked down to the next room, came back in the room, and then they were reinforcements. The British soldiers, they had to walk down 3 hallways and come back as reinforcements to get across the idea that, even though they had a huge advantage from a resources standpoint, when they needed more, they had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So it wasn't a perfect representation, but again, it was that idea of just trying to paint the picture of these, specific events.
So can I ask you a question to not interrupt the flow? So I think one of the things I find most fascinating is you're hearing about 2 dynamically different but incredible lessons. What was your process for recognizing these 3 scenarios? What did you see in a textbook that said, hey, this is how I connect it to do as a interactive activity, or this represents, like, the idea the kids don't understand how long it takes to prepare a gun for battle between every single shot, and my thought process of how do I simulate that. What is your thought process? And maybe you might not remember that exactly, but I think that's the creative part that you may not even tap into a PLN for. You just have to separate yourself from textbook and worksheet and really like get into that competitive or creative space.
Yeah, so I would say one is I tried to use kinesthetic instruction like this a lot in my classroom. And so doing it a lot was one way that just kind of helped me figure out ways to incorporate it more. But also, to quote Dave Burgess again, he talks about in his book, if you haven't read Teach Like a Pirate, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book. He talks about there are, creative people, and then there are people that say they aren't creative. And his philosophy is everybody is creative. Saying you're not is just hindering yourself. And I always use this strategy before I read his book, and when I read his book, it made me realize the strategy I was using is I ask myself questions. I don't know what made me think of this is a great kinesthetic lesson. I think I just saw it, but I would just read the chapter or I'd read the section. I mean, we're talking like a page and a half for each of these different scenarios, and I would just probably pace around my room or pace around wherever I was. I like to walk while I think. And I would just ask myself, how do I get the kids to experience this? What can I do so that they are going to feel what the soldiers are feeling? How can I paint the picture of the, specific piece of history that I want them to learn? I just keep asking myself questions, and something eventually comes to me. And chances are when I did this lesson the first time, I know I added scenarios. And I know I modified the scenarios from time to time because you see it and you say, oh, you know what? Like, that didn't really paint the picture that I was looking for. It was close. And then you find ways to tweak it. But really, just questioning yourself to push yourself towards that has always been my strategy for creativity.
Because I think that's the important thing, that hopefully through this podcast and through the other powered up resources, it's not just look at this glam and just say, oh, realistically, I took someone else's great idea and made it look nice. The ultimate goal is, the reason we're doing lesson lens is to not just glorify one lesson, but talk about how it was built year after year with revision, or even honestly, like in my scenario, it was day after day. Hey, how can I take this obviously intriguing and enjoyable activity my kids are loving, and what is the next step? What else can I do? How else can I tap in? So sorry to interrupt, but that was an important thing to kind of point. So obviously the kids are acting out the scenarios, participating. I can envision 5th graders running down 3 hallways to get back in time. And
no, they had the march, man. Soldiers did.
All right. Well, I'm just saying that my classroom management may need to be improved for that to run smoothly. So what are you doing besides just rolling out and sharing what is this objective, what is this scenario, and the guidelines for the kids? What are you doing during the lesson?
So it's definitely preparing the space, knowing what you want to set the space up to do so. And it's being very clear on the expectations. Like I said, this is not a game. This is a scenario. I am setting one side up to most likely lose. I want you to follow the rules, because if you don't, we won't understand the experience that I'm trying to create for you. Like I said, they still had fun. They still were competitive. Even if they had to stand in that box and throw with their opposite arm, they were still trying their hardest to hit the other line with their bullets or their paper balls. So that's a big piece is setting those expectations, monitoring the simulation as it takes place to make sure that everybody's following along. You see a kid get hit, if they don't go down, say, hey, Johnny, like, you got hit, sit down, things like that. And then the experience is fun. It's a big part of it, but then it's slowing everything down, getting them to reflect on those questions and answer those questions, and then circle a conversation around that. So like I said, I really had them reflect on the experience, what it felt like. I wanted them to have those real feelings like the soldiers did. And then it was connecting it to history. They would try to answer that. Some would know, some would not. I would tell them to kind of just like jot a word or two of what they thought it connected to, and then we'd have a class conversation. What was this specifically connected to? I would add my 2 cents, and then I would say, okay, now summarize what we just talked about in your packet. And so it was that reflection time that was super important, and then transitioning into the next activity. Just knowing what those scenarios are, so that you're ready to flow from one to the next, but just having fun with it. I mean, the first time I did it, I thought it was going to take one class, and it took 2, because I wasn't ready to transition everything. And after that, I was able to knock it out in a class period, because I was able to just move them from one to the next, because I knew exactly where we were going. But for me, it was making sure that I gave them that time to experience it, and then I gave them that time to reflect on it. I think there's a lot of times where we'll see that most of the kids are done. They could probably use 3 or 4 more minutes to do it, but you're like, I need to get to this, I need to get to that, and you kind of just move them along. And that's just a natural part of teaching at times, unfortunately. This is one of those times that I said to myself, I'm not moving on until everybody answers the reflection questions, because that was the most important piece of the lesson. And then the follow-up to that was they had to go home and tell their parents or someone at home stories of what they did. And they had to reference, this is what it taught me in history, because I really wanted them to share that experience at home.
Man, your explanation is making me regret high school and memories that I could have shared about. And again, this experience, when you can connect and when you can recognize. I think the kids these days, I'm sure our teachers said this about our generation too, but kids these days don't understand, because everything is on demand, that creating a scenario and disadvantages is a huge portion of history. And I view your role as much the narrator, making sense of all the activities and this summary to say, here's the substance behind it all. And really, really cool. So I guess you kind of already shared your emphasis, your advice, and maybe if you don't mind me shifting from this specific, because you've run it a few times, you've even how you manage it, unless you have an answer to this.
I actually do want to add one more thing. I'm not 100% positive, because I did a lot of lessons similar to this in the simulation aspect, but I know for a fact when I started doing this very early on, I didn't have the reflection questions printed out and prepared for the students to write and answer. I knew I wanted to talk about it, and it was, hey, what was that experience like? What did that relate to? And it was, one kid, it was a few kids raising their hand and one kid answering. And after that, I realized how important that written reflection was, because I wanted every student to engage in that reflection process. And that's when I started to do the simple paper packet. It was pretty much the same questions for every scenario, but they obviously had different answers. So having that piece was super important that I didn't have when I first did it.
So I think you kind of answered where I was leading in this kinesthetic learning. Really, what advice would you give? And I think the main thing is, if you don't give kids, and sorry to answer your question or kind of mirror what you're saying, if you don't give kids the chance to reflect, then most likely they'll go home and their reflection will be, I had a lot of fun at school today. There was some learning there, but I had fun at school today, which is a great thing. That's what we want. But when you do a true reflection, did they learn anything while they enjoyed their time in school? Uh, uh, that's a hard question to answer. And I think giving that time to actually process and reflect is where the deep connection comes in.
Absolutely. You have to give them time to connect the dots because they're not going to synthesize that material themselves.
Absolutely. So I know we're kind of getting towards the end of this. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I think about this frequently based off some of the guests that we've had in our short time so far of recording this podcast. And the idea of, I often view teaching as 180 times the 4 subjects that I teach, or maybe more, as all of the lessons that I have to prepare. But realistically, they're opportunities to make an impact. And I know that the idea of doing 500 dynamic lessons is probably not realistic, but trying to bring in high quality activities that you don't need to create motivation artificially through prizes or candy or these type of things. When you just plan good, solid lessons that have kids up and interested in the learning, it creates a huge difference in your classroom. And I think that's where we're both getting in both of ours, as well as what you've heard through some of our other guests, is when you take that extra opportunity to really dive in, man, oh man, does it get paid back to you in solidifying all that you were trying to teach, and realistically teaches it so much better.
It does. And I think it's really important, what this segment does offer, because we ask this to all of our guests, is that it's so important to reflect on teaching as much as possible. And we're so busy in the classroom that it really is tough it's impossible to have the time to reflect on every lesson that you deliver. But the ones that I would say are less traditional or less in the typical style that you do, I think it's really important to reflect on those. A new content that you're teaching or a new method that you're trying is really important. But what I would really encourage too is reach out to the resources you have in your district to observe you, to stop in and check it out, offer you some advice. I'm very fortunate to be in that position now as an instructional coach, and I've had teachers that invite me in, and what I'm seeing is incredible. I love the lessons that I'm watching, and a lot of times I will see one small thing that is glaringly obvious to me. It's not a bad thing. It's just hey, why don't you do this first and that second type of thing. Very simple. And the teacher will look at me and say, oh my God, I never thought of that. And it's so obvious to me because I'm not in the trenches teaching the lesson. When you're teaching, you are totally engrossed in the content. You're totally engrossed in your kids. It's impossible to take a step back, or it's very difficult to take a step back and watch. And when you allow others to come into your classroom, and it is a vulnerable experience, but a lot of times there's very simple things that you can tweak that'll have a huge impact and not necessarily make the lesson better, but a lot of times my advice makes the lesson less stressful for the teacher. It takes a little bit more pressure off of them because they can just tweak or modify approaches that they take. So I enjoyed this. I thought it was fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought about saying like it's going to be like a lesson Smackdown between the two of us, but I didn't want it to be competitive because that would be impossible. Although we were a little competitive. We guessed the subject. I got it right. You got it wrong. But that's not important.
I swore you were going to do a lesson on Bloxels or your marble activity. That's where I thought you were heading. You tricked me this time.
Yep. I'll roll my marble project out another time.
Oh my gosh, this episode needs to end.
Yes. So we appreciate you listening as always. Matt and I are going to share all of our resources on the Powered Up forums, whether it's a lesson plan or it's some documents or screencasts that we can share. Matt doesn't know that I'm telling him that I was going to tell him to do that, but he's going to now. We invite you to engage on those forums. We keep saying this, it's a small community now, but we want this community to grow. We want it to be a place where you can ask questions, look for feedback, share your own lessons, share your own experiences, and help others grow as you grow yourself. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this podcast, either on a podcast platform or on YouTube or on both. You can follow us on all social media at PowerEduUp. And as always, all of our information is on powereduup.com. We appreciate you listening and watching. We hope you have a fantastic day, a fantastic week whenever you are listening to this. And Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
All right. As this episode powers down, hopefully we leave you feeling extra powered up. We'll talk to you next episode. See you guys.